Hi, welcome to my channel. My name is Anne and today I'm going to tell you about my 5 favorite books of all time. I realized recently that even though I've been blogging since 2013 and vlogging since 2019, I have never talked about my all-time favorite books. In videos I've mentioned in passing that this is one of my favorite books or things like that, but I've never made an actual video or blog post about my favorite books, so that's what I'm doing right now. I've got a list of 5 favorite books or series that I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to go through them in chronological order of when I came to know and love them. And there are so many more books that I would consider one of my favorite books or one of my favorite fantasy books or things like that, but in terms of the ultimate list of 5 favorite books, this is probably it. These are the books that I think of the most, the books that I resonated with the most, or that have a sense of nostalgia to them, or that just hit me hardest. There are so many more books that in the moment I give them 5 stars and I really love them and I think they might become favorites, but then I end up kind of forgetting about them, or just there isn't that emotional connection. This list is really based on the emotional connection I have to the books. So without further ado, let's get into them. The first book I'm going to talk about is a classic, and it's Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. This was published in 1847 and it famously tells the story of Cathy and Heathcliff. It is a frame narrative. It's told through the eyes of Mr. Lockwood, who moves to Thrushcross Grange, I think the house is called, and his landlord is Heathcliff, and he gets a very strange vibe from him and he gets really intrigued and interested in what is happening around these parts. And then Nellie, the housekeeper, proceeds to tell the story of what happened 30 years ago between Heathcliff and Cathy and all of the other characters. I know there are a lot of people who really don't like this book because they don't like the toxicity of the relationship between Cathy and Heathcliff, but I think for me, I have never seen this as a romantic book, or at least maybe when I was 16 or 15, but over the years I haven't seen this as a romance story. To me it's more of a tragedy, a story of people who treat each other very horribly, who are thrown together in awful circumstances and who just behave terribly and are pushed to extremes. And Heathcliff is of course a very villainous character. He is not a romantic hero in any sense to me. I just really enjoy that awfulness of the story. These people just trying to live their life the best way they can and making life miserable for each other. That doesn't sound like a very good story, but I just really love this. The way it's written, the characters who are awful, but I still love them. And this is also one of those books that is really a nostalgic favorite for me. I read this in high school for my English class. I think I was probably 16 or so, and I talked about it with my English teacher and she lent me her DVD of the film adaptation of this with Ralph Fiennes and I think Juliette Binoche, but I'm not entirely sure. But I remember it felt so good to read this book and then talk about it with my teacher and just love it so much. And I think this is one of the books that really made me love the English language and English literature, and it's probably one of the books that made me study English literature. So it just kind of set me on my path through life, I guess. So I'm very grateful to it for that. Maybe I would have still decided to study English literature if I hadn't read this book, but I think it definitely had a big part in it. Now we move on to the second book, which is also a book that really influenced me in my studies and my love for English literature, and that is the New York Trilogy by Paul Auster. This is, I've always seen it as one novel, but it's actually 3 stories that were published separately from each other throughout the 80s. But the 3 stories within this book are City of Glass, Ghosts and The Locked Room. And this is a postmodern detective novel, or a postmodern take on the detective novel, really subverting the expectations that a reader has of a detective story. And it also very effectively shatters the illusion of reality, which is a very interesting theme to morph into a detective story, because detective stories are always about reality, about finding out the truth. But in that way, this book really subverts expectations, like I said. In the first story, City of Glass, we follow an author of detective novels who becomes a private investigator himself, and he kind of loses himself in this case he becomes involved with, and it's really about identity. He really loses sight of his own identity and he kind of starts to see himself as the protagonist of the detective novels that he writes. And I don't really remember the particulars of the case. I really want to reread this again. It's not really about the case itself, it's more about this character going through things, if that makes sense. Then the second story, Ghosts, tells the story of another private eye. He is called Blue and he has been trained by Brown to become a private eye, and in this story he follows a man or keeps tabs on a man named Black for a client named White. And again, this character really loses himself within this job. This is also the shortest story and I think the one that I like the least, but these stories are all interconnected in weird ways, so it really worked well within the whole. And then the last story, The Locked Room, is about another writer. He finds out that his childhood friend Fanshawe has disappeared, and then he kind of becomes obsessed with the life that Fanshawe has left behind with his wife and his child. And it's about him wanting that life for himself, and also about him trying to find out what happened to Fanshawe, if I remember correctly. One of the reasons why I love this book so much and why it means so much to me is because I wrote my bachelor thesis on it, and it really was a great time writing the thesis. Very stressful as well, but I'm still really proud of the end result. It was about the subversion of reality and the murder of the real, basically, within this novel. And this book really showed me what is possible within fiction. Of course, every book does that, but with this book I really had a sense of awe at how much you can do with subverting reality, subverting expectations of the reader. Anything is possible. You don't have to stick to a genre, you don't have to stick to certain logic. You can do whatever you want, and if you're good at it, you can still make it work. And as someone who loves to write myself and who loves to read, obviously, I really loved that and it really struck me. And I really want to reread this as well. While I was preparing for this video, I was kind of considering doing a vlog in which I reread all of these favorite books, but that's quite a project, so I'm not sure yet if I'm going to do that, but it's definitely at the back of my mind. Also, I hadn't even mentioned that yet, the writing in this is absolutely phenomenal. The third book on this list is Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe by Benjamin Alira-Sanz. This was published in 2012 and has won many prizes, which made for a very annoying cover, as you can see. I've looked far and wide, but this cover does not exist without these stupid printed on stickers on it. I'm still mad about that. Maybe one day it will change. But nevertheless, it's still one of my all-time favorite books. I read this for the first time in 2015, and since then I've reread it 2 or 3 times, I think. The last time I reread it, it was on audiobook, and this audiobook is narrated by Lin-Manuel Miranda. So if anyone still wants to read the book, that might be a good reason to pick up the audiobook. I must say I did prefer reading the physical book because there is quite a lot of dialogue in this without he said, she said behind it, and that doesn't always work very good in audiobook form. Anyway, let's tell you about the plot, even though this is a very popular book within the bookish community. Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe is about 2 Mexican-American boys who live in El Paso, and they meet one summer at the swimming pool when Dante offers to teach Ari how to swim. And from that they develop a beautiful friendship and maybe even something more than that. This story is set in the 80s, which is something I often forget. I'm not sure why, but I think it might have something to do with that. This just feels like a very timeless story. It's about 2 boys growing up, coming of age, finding out their identity. It's all about those universal timeless topics. It's really about family as well. The story is told through Ari's perspective, and there are quite a few secrets within his family that he has to deal with, that he struggles with. But ultimately these families are very warm, very loving units as well. I love both Ari and Dante's families. I love YA stories that deal with family. And like I said, the story has something timeless about it. There's something magical about the writing. Benjamin Alira-Sanz has an amazing writing style that I adore. I know not everybody loves it, which I can understand, but for me it's perfect. It's very lyrical, but it's also very easy to read. It's melodic, there's a lot of great dialogue. I love it. His stories are also often very small stories. They're not very focused on plot. They're more about characters, about getting to know these characters, about them growing up. And that's the case in this one as well. There is some plot, but mostly it's just about these characters and their friendship. And I really love that in stories, so that was perfect for me as well. There's just something about this book that really resonates with me. I can read it endlessly and still be moved by it. And I think that's a sign of a clear favorite novel. Also later this year, the sequel to this book is coming out. Like I said, this was published in 2012, so we've been waiting for it for a very long time. But it's coming out in October and it's called Aristotle and Dante Dive into the Waters of the World, I think. And I'm very excited about it, but also a little bit apprehensive because this is clearly a standalone novel. It was meant that way, I think. And now there's a sequel coming, and whenever that happens, you always have the risk of it really not being very good. I think Benjamin Alira-Sanz writes amazing books and I'll probably still love it, but I'm afraid it will be a bit of a disappointment. Nevertheless, I'm definitely going to read it, and I also don't think it will lessen my enjoyment of this book and my love for this book. Next up, we've got the only series on this list of favorites, and I think this won't come as a surprise to some of you, and it's the Wayfarers series by Becky Chambers. We've got The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, A Closed and Common Orbit, and Record of a Spaceborne Few. Recently, just a few weeks ago in February, the fourth and final book within this series came out. It's called The Galaxy and the Ground Within, but I haven't read it yet. I ordered a special signed edition and it hasn't arrived yet, so I'm still waiting on it. I really want to read it. I think I love it as much as the other ones because I've seen some great reviews and I gave all of these 5 stars. This is a sci-fi series set in space and the first book came out in 2014, but I read it for the first time in 2019. And this one tells the story of the crew of a spaceship called the Wayfarer, and they decide to embark on kind of a dangerous mission that will make them a lot of money. I really got a lot of Firefly vibes from this. If anyone has watched Firefly and liked it, I definitely recommend reading this because it's kind of similar. It's very character focused and character driven and a lot less about the plot, even though there is definitely exciting plot in this one. It's kind of on the slow side, which is why some people haven't really liked it, I think. But to me, that makes it even better because I love slow stories that are focused on characters. The other 2 books are even more character driven and less plot focused, so beware of that before you go in. It isn't this exciting action-packed sci-fi story. That's not what you should expect from these books. These books also don't tell one continuous story. They are companion novels to one another, so they are all focused on a different story, on a different set of characters, and they are also all set on a different planet or a different spaceship. So that's very exciting because you get to see all these different stories from around this universe. Because what I love most about this series is the world and the world building and all the cultures. There's very rich world building within this series because, like I said, all of the stories are set in space. Earth is no longer really inhabitable, and years and years and years ago humans moved into space. Some of them have moved to different planets, some of them are still on the Exodus fleet, which is a fleet of spaceships, very big spaceships that are just in space, and that's where these people live, which is what the third book, Record of a Spaceborne Few, is about. But when humans moved to space, they encountered all these different races, and they ultimately became part of a galactic commons, I think is what it's called, which is a union of all these different races and these different planets. I think I've explained that correctly. But humans are the newcomers in this union. They are the newbies, they are often seen as lesser than, which I thought was very refreshing because I don't really enjoy these stories of humans colonizing space. This is humans as the underdog, which I thought was great. Like I said, there are all these different races and they are all very well thought out. They all have their different cultures, their different habits, and I really enjoyed getting to know all of these different races and these cultures because it is really an exploration of humanity and of what culture means for people, what it means for how we interact with other people, and how that shapes our world and our worldview. And I thought that was very beautifully done. These stories make me feel happy and warm inside because they're written with so much love and so much attention to detail. These are really feel-good stories for me, but like I said, they also delve so much deeper with their explorations of humanity and the philosophical side of it, which is why they've become favorites for me. Like I said, I gave all of them 5 stars and I can't wait to read the 4th book, even though I'm a little sad that it will be the last book because there are so many possibilities for more stories within this universe. Endless possibilities, really. But I understand if Becky Chambers wants to finish up and maybe start something new. In any case, I will read anything she writes because I love her writing. I love the way her mind works, how she sets up stories, how she writes characters. I just adore it. And then we've arrived at the final favorite, and this is a very recent favorite, and it's Words in Deep Blue by Kath Crowley. This was published in 2017, but I read it last year in 2020, and it really was a complete surprise for me how much I love this book, because this was kind of a cover buy for me. It was at least a very random buy for me when I picked it up in the bookstore earlier in 2020. It caught my eye in the young adult section, and I picked it up, I read the back, and it sounded interesting and I decided to buy it, which doesn't really happen to me all that often anymore. Usually when I buy books, it's because I've heard about it in the bookish community or on Goodreads or I've seen it somewhere. And then I make the conscious decision to go to the bookstore and buy that book. I don't really buy random books anymore, but this was an exception and I'm very glad because it turned out to be one of my new all-time favorite books. This novel is set in Australia and it's a dual perspective story. We follow Rachel and Henry. They used to be best friends when they were younger, but they lost contact when Rachel and her family moved away out of the city they lived in, sometime during early high school, I think. However, at the start of the book, Rachel moves back to the city to move in with her aunt because a couple of months ago, Rachel lost her brother. He drowned and she has not really dealt with it. She is very depressed and she moves in with her aunt in the city to see if a change of scenery can change things for her, basically. And she doesn't really want to get back into contact with Henry because it was kind of a conscious decision on her part to no longer have contact with him anymore. But they meet again, and due to certain circumstances, she comes to work in his family's bookstore. Henry's family owns a very special bookstore in town, and Henry has always envisioned his future as taking over the bookstore. But money problems have made that future a bit more unstable, and they might have to sell the bookstore. On the surface, to me, this just seemed like it might be a fun, quick YA novel about books, about reading, with a possible love story within it, but it turned out to be so much more than that. It's an exploration of grief, of death, and especially that exploration of death is what hit me very much. I think about death more than is healthy, probably. I'm very afraid of death. And in this novel, I read things that I'd never seen written down before. It was like I was seeing my own thoughts reflected, and that was just very special to me, and it meant a lot to me. And as if that wasn't enough, the ode to books and to reading and to bookstores that this book is also made me love it even more. There's just something about this novel that really conveys this love for books and stories and bookstores that a lot of us have. I also love the focus on specific books within this novel, and I loved the special bookcase in Henry's family's bookstore, in which people can leave letters to other people, if I remember correctly, or notes. And this book focuses heavily on those letters as well, which I thought was wonderful. I really want to reread it, even though it's been only a couple of months since I read it for the first time. But I kind of had that feeling immediately after finishing it, that I wanted to read it again, to experience it all again, because I just loved it so much. And that's it for this video. I was kind of nervous to make this because I always feel a bit vulnerable talking about my favorite books. I'm not sure why, but I think it just really feels like opening up and showing you something personal about myself, even though it's just books. I'd love to hear from you in the comments about what your favorite book is, or a few of your favorite books, because it's really difficult to choose. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like it if you liked it, and subscribe to my channel if you want to see more of my videos in the future. And have a wonderful day. Bye!